Alright everyone, well, it's time for another movie review of one that I anticipated for this year, the third entry in the Conjuring universe, The Conjuring 3, The Devil Made Me Do It, or, well, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. That's right, this is the first one not to be numbered and instead have a subtitle in its title, and not to mention also the first one not to be directed by James Wan, only produced as him this time around, and yeah, I can definitely see that. Instead, it's directed by the same guy who directed the Conjuring spin-off, Curse of La Llorona, a rather mediocre spin-off that happens to exist in the same universe, and yeah, I wasn't a big fan of that one either. It was very lackluster and was a little bit iffy on him directing this movie as well, as you probably saw in my most anticipated movie list of both last year and this year, being that this was also not only delayed from last year due to a COVID-19 pandemic, but also given a hybrid release on both HBO Max and in theaters as of right now. But let's talk about some of the good stuff. Yes, this actually is better than Curse of La Llorona. I will give some things that I did like about this movie, then some things I didn't like about this movie. So, does it live up to what the first two movies did, or does it take a bit of a step backwards and suffer the typical third movie syndrome? It takes a bit of a step backwards, unfortunately. So, if you have high hopes thinking that this will be just as good as the first two, then you might be a bit disappointed. But let's talk about the good things, as I said before. First of all, yes, our two main actors, both Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson, return as both Ed and Lorraine Warren, and their performances are once again great. I mean, their character chemistry is there. They talk about a little bit backstory about how they first met, which is a nice touch to the movie. So yeah, keep in mind, I'm going to try to be minimal on spoilers, but bear in mind you might hear a little bit that are minor to rather moderate here and there. And this time around they investigate a case which, well, starts out at the very beginning of the movie that pretty much is related to what they deal with an exorcism. And this time it involves the devil, more or less, and a court case. That's where it pretty much goes into. So I like the necessary steps that it takes, and it's not afraid to take risks. The problem is, it doesn't have 100% payoff like the last two movies did. And I'm sure that, like any other Hollywood movies, it's probably not 100% accurate. Yes, this is based on a real case that took place in 1981 in Brookfield, Connecticut, and it involves a guy who commits a murder and blames the devil, and as you guessed, the court and the law don't really believe in that sort of crap and is sentencing him to death. So it drags on into a bit of a mystery case involving the devil and Lorraine Warren with her, powers and able to see past real life and beyond the grave and so forth. You get a lot of that interesting stuff, which is fascinating. So I'll give credit to the first half, it's good. There are a few jump scares that you might notice, but the film lacks a bit of that tension, especially in the second half. It starts to go in a bit of a weird direction, and that's where things kind of slow down a little bit. I mean, don't get me wrong, it is entertaining at some parts, but I feel as though the second half didn't really interest me as much. You got a lot of side stories and parts that feel a bit unfocused, and that's the real problem with this movie. And another thing is, it's also less than 2 hours. It's about 1 hour and 52 minutes, which even then, I feel as if it dragged a little bit. I mean, the last two movies, they had so many fascinating parts that really kept me invested. But this movie, not as much. It's not bad, considering my expectations for the director of this movie had me lowering down a little bit. I mean, my expectations for the most part were neutral, but I can't say I'm fully disappointed. I mean, the soundtrack is good, you expect a lot of that old music in there, and you do have a couple of those moments that definitely make you really feel for the characters and everything like that. But I feel as though the plot has maybe too much story, and that's where it becomes a bit unfocused, thus making it less interesting than the first two films. So, I guess you could say, I really do miss James Wan as the director. His direction was just better in both tension, suspense, and everything else that makes a great horror film and gives it that solid twist. But this film, it doesn't do it as good. So, you may give it a watch if you have an HBO Max subscription and see it for what it is. But, as I said, keep your expectations to a much lower level, otherwise you might be disappointed. So, yeah, I watched it on HBO Max. I don't feel bad that I didn't see it in theaters. I really wanted to, like I did with the first two films. In fact, I've seen pretty much every other spin-off in theaters as well, which some of them are hit or miss. So I'd say this franchise has come along pretty well. It's had its few hit or miss films, And I'd say this one is kind of in between hit and miss. It's decent. That's all I'll give it right there. So, for a film that I was kind of iffy on when it comes to the director, I could safely say it's at least better than Curse of La Llorona, but still not as good as the first two Conjuring movies. So, that's all I'll say right there. Decent, but not great like the first two. So I guess you could say it definitely sort of suffers the typical third movie syndrome, but still keeps me invested somewhat. So, my final verdict right there is just a plain two weird modes up. Decent, but not as good as the first two, as I said before several times. So, till next time, keep watching.